From Country Roads by John Denver. Country roads take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, Mountain Mama, take me home. Country roads.
Welcome back to the Reading Room Ruffians, your favorite library podcast. We are all in an Appalachian rage, so bless JD's heart, because he sure is a character, and we're going to talk about him today. Do you still need our names? Fair enough. This is Mallory, along with co-hosts Ariel, Carla, and Zach. This is usually where I would tell you about some things we are doing at Ripley and Ravenswood, but for you, it will be week 1 of our summer reading program, and that will consume us for the next 6 weeks. We hope to see you for fun and learning at both of our libraries. Today, we are joined by the editors of Appalachian Reckoning, a region response to Hillbilly Elegy, Meredith McCarroll, writer and writing coach, and Anthony Harkins, professor of history at Western Kentucky University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, just go ahead and tell us about yourselves, your background, what you're up to, stuff like that. It's a good way to get, to let our listeners get to know you a bit better.
Well, I am Meredith McCarroll. I was born and raised in Western North Carolina, where my family's been for a long time. And I made my way into Appalachian studies after studying critical race theory. So a lot of my work kind of blends those two, thinking about region, thinking about constructions of race and power. And we'll get more into how Tony and I got connected with this book. But I have my first book is called Unwhite Appalachia Race and Film, which looks at representations of Appalachia in Hollywood cinema. And then was lucky to work with Tony on this book, Appalachian Reckoning. Worked for many years as a writing professor, English professor, and now have launched into the world of freelance writing and editing just in the past year. Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah, that is.
And Tony?
Yeah, so I'm Tony Harkins. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Appalachia, and from really many places, though, kind of around the world, and then grew up mostly in New Mexico. But I got into this topic by looking at the image of the hillbilly in my graduate history work. I'm a history professor, and started thinking about this representation and how broad it is and how many places it's seen, and would it be an interesting study of a stereotype. And so out of that came my book, Hillbilly, Cultural History of American Icon. And then from that, I got into, knowing more about actually coming to Appalachia and doing research and going to the Appalachian Studies Conference for multiple years. And from that, we eventually got connected together on this project on Appalachian Reckoning. And I'm a professor at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green.
All right. So just, I guess, for you guys to know, everybody here, everybody else, we got Mallory, Ariel, Carla, and myself. So Ariel, Mallory, and Carla, they all work at the library in Jackson County, West Virginia. We're all born in the general area. I'm actually over in Seattle now, so I've moved away and also, lost most of the accent, which we're going to talk about later.
Yeah.
Towards the end. But anyway, just we're all pretty local, and we've been anxious to talk to you about this because after reading Hillbilly Elegy, which we all did for Ariel's deep dive pick a few weeks ago, it obviously frustrated us and stuff like that. So what we wanted to first, I guess, talk about, what was it about Hillbilly Elegy that affected you all so much that you felt the need to compile all these stories together and get a more, I guess, clear picture of what Appalachia is from Appalachians themselves?
Well, I would say that I guess I kind of was the initiator of the main part of this project, and I was just sort of astounded by the amount of press and attention and sales that it was generating, and tried to understand why that was. I didn't think it was for the writing, which I didn't think was very good. It certainly wasn't for the scholarship. It's not at all a scholarly work. And so I was just trying to figure out why has it become what it has become? And it was all in the context of the 2016 election. And I think that's clearly the answer. of why it became so enormous because of this sort of Trump, whatever avalanche that was happening. So all of that led to proposing a panel at the Appalachian Studies Conference that next year on, different reactions. And I found a few people who had written about it, and we got together. And the reaction to Appalachian Studies was just enormous. There were, for Appalachian Studies Conference, there were over 100 plus people in the room. Everyone had opinions, strong opinions. Both parts that deeply resonated with them and parts they were deeply angry about. And so it was clear that there was definite interest. And then driving back from that conference, I got a call from West Virginia University Press about putting together that, building from that panel into a whole book. And so that's how that got started. And then Meredith, you can tell about how we unified.
Yeah,
forces.
absolutely. I guess I have two answers about how I got involved with the book and how I responded to JD Vance. I was living in Maine, where I still live now, when Hillbilly Elegy came out, and I saw it and just sort of avoided it. And over, well-intentioned liberal Mainers or people living in Maine kept saying to me, "Oh, I read Hillbilly Elegy, and now I kind of get where you're from." I was like, well, I guess I need to read this book. And then I read it. And shortly after that, I had dinner with Susan Faludi and her husband. I don't know if you know Susan Faludi, the historian and writer. And she was the first person who kind of gave me permission to acknowledge how infuriating the book was. She said that she literally threw the book across the room as she was reading it, because it was just like, and she's not from Appalachia, but she was just like, what is he talking about? This is ridiculous. And so in that conversation, I remember talking with her and her husband, Russ, about, yeah, this is a really crazy thing that's happening, the way that people are responding to this book. And then I said, yeah, people keep saying that they understand me and where I'm from because they've read this book. And I don't know how to square that. It feels pretty terrible. So there was that personal response that I felt. But at the same time, following that same conference, I think, or right around that same time, West Virginia University Press reached out to me about a different project that was bringing together personal narratives from Appalachia. And so I was at work on that book. Tony was at work on the collection that they had solicited from him. And I think that what happened was right around the same time we checked in with that editor. And I remember what I said was, I feel like there's a lot, like this writing is beautiful, but I don't know what holds it together. And Tony, I think yours was like, there's a lot of great information, but there's not a lot of heart. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I generally do.
Yeah. And so thankfully, this editor had this great idea to merge the projects. And so that to me is part of what makes the book more complex and I think better than it would have been maybe either of those book projects otherwise, because we were coming at it kind of from both personal places and scholarly places. And but that's how we got connected.
Okay.
That editor's name is Andrew Brzezinski.
Brzezinski?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. He's at Oklahoma now.
Yeah, that's
maybe?
very neat.
Oklahoma,
so.
nice. So actually, I had a question about specifically that now that you've mentioned it, how the book came together. Okay, so when I first, I guess, heard about that thing in I don't know whether it was in the beginning of the book where you guys talk about it, or it was in a different interview I read of you guys. But the book is divided up into two parts. Is it those two separate parts what the original books were going to be, or are they intermixed with each other?
Intermixed, I think. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think the bulk of them are kind of the two projects, but we saw we wanted to make sure it was a cohesive, interconnected thing, not like one chunk having nothing to do with each other. So we saw ways to integrate them, and the photography and the poetry, which was also part of the Meredith's original project, was part of that blending as well.
Yeah, that's all interspersed throughout the book. So how'd you guys get all the contributors? I saw that a lot of them were academics, but not all of them, obviously. There was people who did, obviously, photography and other sorts of things, poetry.
Well, Tony, I mean, part of it, like you said, really started at the conference, right? In person, soliciting that.
Right. People who I reached out to be part of this panel, who I knew or who had written about it, So I mostly just looked at who's written about hillbilly elegy. That's how I got Bob Hutton and Dwight Billings, and then once the project was going to be made into a book, dug a little deeper and found some other people as well. And the photography was through
Roger May
project, and looking at Appalachia, and then Meredith had a huge slew of colleagues and people she knew and connections, and so
it was interesting though, because I think that there is this traditional way that scholarly books seek contributors, and you put out a call for papers, and it's a little bit of a closed circuit. I mean, you're only going to reach people who know to go look there. And so part of the conversation that I remember having with Andrew was, how do we I remember saying, I want to hear from farmers. I want to hear from, students. I want to hear from just all kinds of different people. And it is, I think, a challenge to try to figure out how to solicit people. And so part of what we were able to do, both individually and together, was go to the people that we knew and then ask them part of, like, who's doing the work in your area. So we have photography from people like Lou Murray. We have, I think that kind of expanded the reach a little bit so that it wasn't purely academic.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to ask also, just in general, there's a lot of these academic papers, especially towards the first chunk of the book, very well cited and stuff like that. And you've also got this poetry. What was, I guess, the impetus for including the poetry and the photographs and the little tiny short stories and stuff in there as well? I mean, obviously you have the stories in the second half of the book, the personal stories, but these are all like a little bit longer form than the shorter stuff.
I mean, I think I grew out of the Appalachian studies tradition, which is very intersectional, right, and very interdisciplinary. And so it's very common to have, poetry and scholarship and artwork and social activism and political engagement all in the same conference, sometimes in the same sessions. And so that was very standard sort of way that Appalachian studies, I think, has thought of itself and has always worked. So it didn't seem unnatural at all to do that.
I think there was an opportunity for some writers who might be scholars to express themselves differently here, to make space for the fact that the head and the heart doesn't have to be totally separate. And I think that that's part of what works about the book. We wanted to respond with facts, and we wanted there to be a scholarly aspect to say, we don't just have our feelings hurt. Like, there are valid, legitimate reasons that people are upset about this. And it's because it's inaccurate information. And so part of the way to correct that was to come at it from a scholarly perspective. But I think part of it too, one of the metaphors that we used a lot, creating the book, but also talking about the book, was the idea of passing the mic around, because JD Vance was taking up a lot of space at this time. He was stepping to the mic a lot and was not passing it around. And so part of what we wanted to do was to have a lot of different tones, a lot of different kinds of people represented, a lot of different perspectives represented, because that kind of accuracy of representation felt like the best way to combat the singular voice of JD Vance, rather than just saying that he was wrong, just to kind of drown him out with a lot of different voices to complicate what he was saying that simplified the region.
Sure. That makes sense. And actually, on that point in general, there's obviously a large diversity of voices in the book itself. I was surprised to find that there were I'm not going to say so many, but there were several, I don't know what you would call them, essays or papers, written in defense of sort of JD Vance's point of view for some things. Like, specifically that it is like, there are definitely some hard truths about the Appalachian area that have to be understood and faced, and we can't just be defensive about it, right? So it's mostly in that middle section. I'm trying to see whose paper.
Kelly Hansel is the one that has a piece called "In Defense of JD Vance."
Yes, that was one I was going to bring up in particular for this, but there was that one and another one. But yeah, we can just talk about that briefly. I was surprised to see that.
Well, I mean, I think that's that's part of why the book resonated so broadly. I think because there are definitely people in the region who don't defend the book, but they definitely saw things that connected to them, and it is a region of struggle. It always has been, and economically and the consequences of larger socioeconomic factors have definitely affected the region. So I think that's a legitimate part of the story. And we didn't want to sort of be, prescriptive in terms of who we would include and who we wouldn't include. I think overwhelmingly, the voices are critical of hillbilly elegy and not so much his life story, which is his life story, and he's free to tell it, of course, but the idea that it is somehow universal, right? That it is more of a culture. I think Dwight Billings makes that point super clear. How you can't have a memoir of a culture, you can't have a memoir of an entire community. It just erases all of the diversity and the range of people. And so that was the thing, as Meredith says, we really wanted to highlight was as many people as possible, within the confinement of what we're doing. We're not trying to speak to every single person in Appalachia, but to show that range.
I think a little bit about, I'll use a different example here. My background is in studying African American literature, and sort of the history of African American literature moves from this need to defend that everything is perfect within Appalachian or within African American culture. And then it takes years for there to be this opening up where it's like, no, this is hard. This is, these things are not great within our culture, and there's this beauty. And so for me, having that's when you get realistic representation. Once you're defensive and you're trying, and it's a counter argument, it's really limited. And so I think that if we had not allowed for, if we had censored this in some way to only have voices that were agreeing with one another, then it just wouldn't be it would be doing the same kind of thing that Vance had done.
Totally. No, that totally makes sense. Let's see here. What was I going to talk about next? Okay, yeah, this is switching topics a little bit. In this book, there seems to be, at least for the first chunk, a lot of discussion surrounding the migration out of Appalachia, and less about the actual state of the region itself, it felt like to me. I guess, can you guys talk a little bit more about that? Why was there that much focus, at least in I don't know if this is generally true of the literature or not, but about this migration out of Appalachia? Or maybe I just got the wrong vibe from the book. I'm not entirely sure.
I guess partly because that's his story, right? I mean, he's talking about being a second generation, and part of that migration story is very much part of his story. It's part of a lot of academics' stories from Appalachia who've had to go elsewhere for jobs or for education or whatever. And so I think that's a piece of it too. We didn't say in any way, you can only talk about, part of it's who we happened to pick and who agreed to be part of it, and what stories they wanted to tell. And we did not, again, prescribe that in any way. I think that's, I think you're making a fair point there, but it was also just about what was the story people wanted to tell for themselves.
I think too, and Zach, you might have experienced this being out of the region, but I think that many people who are from Appalachia living away may have felt the weight of hillbilly elegy differently. I think if you're living in, I don't know, West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky, you might be like, well, obviously that's not true. And you don't have to convince anyone that that's not true, because you can look all around you and you can see, queer artists and liberal bookstores and conservative churches, and you can see all of this just like out your window. And so you don't have to convince anyone that this isn't representative of your experience. But I think for me anyway, as an expat living in Maine, I really felt like I had to defend that. And so I wonder if that's why more people were kind of weighing in on that. I think part of it is that often academics do have to leave the region to get a job, and that might just be like kind of the practical part. But I think it was, I believe that I felt it differently because it did feel sort of like it carried more weight. And I felt like I was constantly having to defend. I mean, I've always felt like I had to defend Appalachia. That book just didn't help.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree. I've had to defend against the stereotypes for quite a while. So I get you there. And also, yeah, it's the lack of jobs. That's the main reason I moved as well. I couldn't even find something in like Ohio area for what I was doing.
In that situation, I think anyone who has left the region understands that you want to be able to say, no, it is not simply that. And yes, there have been these extractive industries that have left us without jobs. There is poverty, and the way it's been represented circles back and makes us feel badly about ourselves. Like, you want to hold the both sides. And that's what I think we're trying to do in this book. But it's so much easier to just say, no, Appalachia is beautiful. Everything's wonderful there. But no place is simply that way,
Yeah. When I moved to Missouri, that was a thing that I had to do, was defend West Virginia a lot. And one of the things that I said, I was like, West Virginia, it can be a dumpster fire, but that's my dumpster fire, and it's the best one there is.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's right. And I also think you kind of, come to perceive yourself as a hillbilly only in beyond that context, right? When it all depends on who's calling who a hillbilly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost like that. What is it? That it's our word type deal that people have.
Yeah, like West Virginia is a fantastic state, and we are a great big bunch of like caring people, and there's so much diversity, and the landscape is beautiful. But there are so many problems with us too. So. There's good and bad with it, but
I'm not sure if this is something that you all have noticed, but in other areas like I'm in Seattle, we talk about specifically cities or towns, and I noticed that in Appalachia, all of these different essays and papers and things, people talk about specifically counties as opposed to towns and cities. Is that something that you've noticed just in general people talk about?
Yeah, I think that's a Southern thing. I mean, we definitely do that in Kentucky, Western Kentucky. Everyone refers to counties. I just not from here. I don't think in county terms. It's been a long time since I've been here. I'm still like, I don't know where, how many counties that is over and whatever. So it's just but I don't know if that's unique somehow also an Appalachian, distinctly Appalachian as well.
I wonder if it's rural, because I'm in Maine, which technically is parts of it are Appalachian, but I think about people in like Aroostook County. That's what they say. I couldn't tell you a town in Aroostook County, but people say that they're from Aroostook County. And it means, what I understand is you are from a rural place, and we're naming it by the county more than the town. For me, like, I start my essay in this book saying that, like, talking about the fact that I'm from Haywood County. And for me, it's about where I am and when I'm going to say that. But in that moment, I was in a college classroom, and I knew that no one knew where Waynesville was. And I needed to signal that it was near Asheville, but also very different than Asheville. And so people say Haywood County to show that it's the western part of the state, it's the mountains. But then if you're talking to other people from that part of the world, then you might say, the name of the town. But I wonder if it's about rurality more than...
That makes sense to me. Yeah. Smaller areas, or like the towns themselves might not be big enough or matter enough in the grand scheme of things to be called out.
Well, in some ways, in defining yourself as not urban.
Yeah.
I think, you know, you're both defining yourself as rural and as not urban. 'Cause I remember in your story, Meredith, the professor was like, respect,
Yeah.
right? He said,
Well, because everyone else was
county,
from
right?
like Charlotte or Raleigh or like a
Right,
city
exactly.
in North Carolina. But then there's another level too, because I grew up in town, and there were people who were from out in the county, and so within Waynesville, I would not say that I was from out in the county because I could walk to town. So, yeah, there's I guess it can get more and more specific as you go. But I do think that saying county denotes rurality somehow.
That makes sense. I definitely hear it only in when I have gone back home or have been around other rural areas. They talk about counties a lot more. Whereas here, it's like all towns and cities. Just sort of an interesting, weird thing. So I guess this was not one of mine, but while collecting and compiling all these different works, what sort of feelings came out for each of you, and how, if at all, did those feelings differ from your read-through of Hillbilly Elegy? Like, how was it affected, I guess? Or how did you differ in your reading of Hillbilly Elegy versus reading all of these things? They're coming from people who are, I would say, more, I don't want to do the no true Scotsman type thing, right? But from actually more Appalachian than JD Vance, who I also just don't consider Appalachian. I mean,
I think my experience in reading through these was just sort of this rush of, I guess the first word that's coming to mind is pride, which is interesting because there's such different voices and I don't connect with a lot of them. I mean, they're very different experiences for me, but it was like when we finally like pulled it all together, I just remember being like, yes. There's no way to describe Appalachia or to define Appalachia. And when we were on book tour, there were times that people really wanted us to do that. But flipping through that book, it was like, yeah, we have done this. This thing is happening by pulling together all of these voices. So for me, it was educational. I learned stuff. There were perspectives that were really different than mine, versus the kind of like just the way that JD Vance wrote with such assuredness and singularity just made me resistant. And I felt very yielding as I was reading Appalachian Reckoning, just like, yeah, cool. Oh, really? Maybe. All right. And when I was reading Hillbilly Elegy, there was a lot of, that's not true. No, that's not right.
Yeah.
What about you, Tony?
Yeah, and I think the way that he takes an individual and makes them representative of the entire community or society versus the way that the people in our book, we're talking about a single person, an actual person, an actual place, a specific moment in time, which is, the reality of the world, right? It's not that everyone represents some massive thing. Everyone represents what they represent. So that's what I really appreciated it. And I thought the poetry was really effective for me. I don't get a chance to read a whole lot of poetry. And I just thought it captured ideas so succinctly and powerfully. I loved most of the poetry in there.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I think putting the poetry in amongst everything really did help when you're just reading through the book, because, okay, so I've read a ton of academic papers, and after a while they get the slog, it's a little bit, it's like the verbosity and just like the stuff, and then having these little interstitials where you've got the poetry slow you down and sort of like not just be like, okay, yeah, what you're getting through, but pay attention to all the little bits and the syllables and the stuff was really nice. It was a good choice. Is my point. It was a good choice.
Good.
So just in general about the essays or stories or poetry in the book, is there anything in particular that you find that stands out to you as, I mean, it's like, I know it's like picking your favorite child or whatever, but is there anything that really sticks out that you think people, if they had to read only like a couple things from the book, what would you pick out? I mean, I know mine personally, but I wonder if you guys have any.
Well, obviously, Meredith's essay was really the.
It was good. It was good.
The beginning and no, it really was. Yeah. It really was a powerful idea because it's such a small thing. I mean, a single letter, basically, but it speaks to such such profound notions of place and identity and alienation. So I really thought that was a great one. I don't want to really kind of single anybody out. I thought, given what's happened with JD Vance since this book came out, I think it's just pieces like Bob Hutton's Hillbilly Elitism piece really is more true than ever. You were asking about why we had voices in defense, and partly it was the range of things. Partly it was because, JD Vance was theoretically a different person then, at least somewhat. He was criticizing Trump, and he was, he was supposedly, and he came to the Appalachian Studies Conference. And, but I think it's clear that, and I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt to some degree at the time as well. But I think it's clear that it was always a self-serving project first and foremost. And the people he surrounded himself with understood how he could, marshal it for his own ends. And he's clearly done so very, to the nth degree. So,
yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, the question, if someone would read one essay, is it maybe a different answer than what are my favorites in here? Because I do think that something like Bob's or Dwight Billings' piece that is just, it just kind of tears down the premise of Vance's book. Some of those pieces from the early part of the book. But part of what I love about this collection are, again, like the pieces that don't necessarily speak directly to Vance. A piece that always resonates with me that I think about is Rachel Wise has an essay called Loving to Fool with Things. And in some ways, I think I connected to it because she's writing about her experience also of leaving Appalachia and kind of the shadow of Appalachia as she's interviewing in Cambridge, Massachusetts for a position, and talking about, she's kind of coming to terms with the way that she was raised and integrating these parts of her Appalachian upbringing into the person that she's become. And so I think it's a really lovely essay. And unfortunately, she was never able to travel with us and talk about her essay, but that's one that sticks with me that I think is really, really beautiful.
Oh yeah, I do remember this one. This one was very good. That one. Also, just the cornbread one by Jim Minnick.
Yeah,
that one was just fun.
It's so bizarre, that one. I love it.
It is. I liked there was I think two kind of bizarre ones. There was this one, and then there was I can't remember what the other one
Jeremy
was. But that
Jones
one was a big.
About
yes, it was Jeremy Jones. That's the one. Yeah,
and those are two of my favorite people. So I guess I like people who write strange essays. Yeah.
They were very strange. I was like, when I was going back through, it was like looking at stuff. I was picking those ones out to like take a look at in particular. But also the essay by Lisa Pruitt, what Hillbilly Elegy reveals about race in 21st century America. I thought that one was fantastic as well. So, listeners, if you haven't read the whole book, at least pick out some of these ones because they're excellent. And I think it's definitely something you can just pick and choose which ones you want to read at any given time. Because a lot of them very standalone. So what do you think, if anything, has changed about the perception of Appalachia since Hillbilly Elegy were released and since your book has released? Or do you think at large, has it changed that much? I mean, certainly people who read the book, I would assume, had their minds changed to some degree.
I guess I'm an optimist, and so I look for the positive change. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is, I don't know that this is changing, but I think that perceptions are opening up a little bit. I'm thinking about in Hazard County, Kentucky. I was in that area in Hindman, Kentucky for these really devastating floods 2 summers ago. And there were, really deadly floods, really devastating floods. And I started kind of paying more attention to that part of the world. And a lot of people started paying attention to that part of the world, thinking about how they're going to rebuild and recover from that. And it's also a place that has been really impacted by the opioid crisis. And just recently, my friend Mandy Fugit-Scheffel, who owns a great bookstore in Hazard, Kentucky called the Red Spotted Newt. She has been on PBS, and a lot of stories have been focusing on that community rebuilding. She's in recovery, and she has this vibrant business, and she's quick to do the opposite of what JD Vance did. She's quick to say, sure, this is my story, but look here, look here, look here. Mm-hmm. And when you look around in a place like Hazard, there's amazing stuff that is happening. There are new businesses coming downtown. Many of them are owned by young people. A lot of them are owned by people in recovery who are really want to give back in a positive way to the community that they felt like they kind of took from for a while. And so to me, that is a positive thing that is, again, I don't know if it's changing or if people are just seeing it more, but I kind of have this feeling that if you shine a spotlight in any part of Appalachia, you will see really strong, vibrant communities supporting one another. We just tend not to shine the lights there. Mm-hmm. And maybe if I'm being optimistic, maybe there's more shining of those lights.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess one thing that's changed is I think the centrality of coal has kind of turned a corner. It's been declining for, almost half its history. It's been in decline in terms of job creation, right? I mean, that's one thing people forget is how early the outmigration is happening. But I think that's also opened up the possibility of conversations about what the region is that don't just define it by coal. And I think that's a healthy thing, and it's hard to know what is going to replace it. I think that continues to be a big struggle for sure. But, the sort of monocultural perspective that JD Vance brought to his book, I think is not a healthy way to, or useful or a accurate way to think about region. And so I think that's been a good thing, although I think, it's obviously not going to be a simple path or a straightforward movement upward all the time.
Sure. So I guess continuing on this sort of vein, there's been a lot of discussion leading up to today's episode about representation or lack thereof, and just from Appalachia in general. And I guess how could okay, let me stop and go back. It's been oh my God, I can't even read or speak. I'm going to claim that it's early in the morning. It's not, but it's almost 11. I don't have an excuse anymore. So basically, there's been a lack of representation in general in the media, positive or negative. I was more negative than positive, but mostly not much positive representation of Appalachians, just in general. I guess why do you think that is, and how can we combat that? Because it's historically, I think, been, we're the dumb hicks out here,
Tony, you should kick us off. You read a whole book on this.
Well, you did too. But yeah, I mean, I think it's always served that purpose for mainstream, whatever, middle class America to envision it as a place that brought its own problems on itself, and therefore don't have to think about the consequences of how the larger economic social structure, in some ways creates those conditions. It's also because it's defined as white, which of course we try hard to show the diversity of the region, and I think others have done so as well. But because it's defined as white, it's also defined as sort of problematically poor, right? I mean, there's a sort of notion that people, minorities, people of color kind of are, it's not surprising that they're poor. There's a sort of expectation they're going to be poor. The system is either because you recognize the system as exploitive or because you think race matters in terms of your outcomes. So, but the fact that white people are poor is always a sort of shocking notion historically. I mean, that's something I've traced in my book. It's the sort of rediscovery of Appalachia periodically And always the sort of idea that, oh, these people are white and they're Christian and they're Protestant and yet they're also poor. So how can that possibly be, right? And it can only be because they, the JD Vance answer, they bring it on themselves, right? They have a culture of poverty. So I've forgotten the question now. I think that's why it continues to serve that purpose. And when I was writing the book back in the 90s, I thought, well, this is kind of going to be the end of this. The idea of hillbilly is going to disappear because all these other stereotypes have become unacceptable anymore. It's not that they disappeared, but they became unacceptable. They were no longer comic strips with deeply racist, African American or Italian or Japanese representations. So I thought this is going to disappear as well. And yet it continues to perpetuate itself and redefine itself over and over and over again, and this book is just the latest example of that. And so it is a place where there's always been this usefulness to have this notion of poor white people, because that shows that we're not a racist society. And it shows that there's nothing really wrong with America. It's just that these people themselves don't know how to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Mm-hmm. The whole idea that JD Vance actually quotes that idea, right? So, I think that's why it continues to resonate. It serves those purposes. It makes people feel like that America, is a fundamentally fair and just place, and our choices industrially and economically and everything have been sound. And it's just some people can't get with the program and change or move, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, that's their own fault.
No, that makes total sense. I guess the second half of the question is how can we as Appalachians combat it, I guess?
One of my favorite stories of Appalachia is the story of Apple Shop. So when the War on Poverty was launched in Letcher County, Kentucky, the Appalachian Regional Commission was formed, and the site for that launch is about whiteness, is about rurality, but there was this move to try to eradicate poverty with these national policies and funding, and so they needed to have a white face for it. So they went to Appalachia. Lots of other people followed and went to Appalachia and told the same story about the region, literally going to the same, down the same roads, taking kind of the same pictures of the same shacks. One of the things that Appalachian Regional Commission funded was an organization called Apple Shop, which is over 40 years old now. And that was an organization that gave people cameras and taught them how to tell their own stories and record stories of the people around them. And so to me, how Appalachians can combat this is to pick up a camera, pick up a pen, pick up a microphone, and to tell their own stories. And when that happens, and it does happen, then it's to me, that's just like the strongest way to dilute the power of the negative or simplistic stereotype about Appalachian people, which is what we hoped this book does in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, totally. Basically just getting more out there, more known. I think the book really does help with that if people do read it. It's difficult to convince anybody to read anything, though, nowadays, so at times. But it's just incredibly well written. Like, I mean, you look at JD Vance's book, and it's just kind of, I would say, not written at the same sort of level as this. I'll be nice. It was just not written at the same sort of level. And there is that, like, obviously stereotype that Appalachians are sort of, again, like I said, the dumb hicks. But, I mean, you can't read this book and think that is the case, just because of the quality, if nothing else. Okay. Meredith, specifically about your essay. So we've discussed our accents in the Hillbilly Elegy episode. And I've sort of gone under the same, I guess, change as you have, because obviously my super thick Appalachian accent I have right now, no, it's completely gone. And it's mostly because I was sort of, I was going into academia. I wanted to get rid of my accent to some degree. I got made fun of sometimes. I think the big one was, for me, was also a pronunciation of on. I think yours was more like own, right? And mine is one. So I got made fun of for saying one all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I also found out that I still use some of the phrases that I didn't realize were regional, like used to could. Apparently that's a thing. I didn't know that until I saw it in the book, and I was just like, oh, man. I've still got one or two. But anyway, I guess in regards to that, is this something that you miss, or is there anything else you tried to suppress aside from the accent to like sort of, I guess, pass in academia?
I think I did have a period of that, and it was all pretty unconscious. But yeah, I grew up in a place, really accented English was spoken where I grew up. And as I continued my education, I think mostly it was when I moved to Boston, and I felt my accent was really a detriment. People, it wasn't just I didn't just feel that way. It was, though people judged me because I said, put your coat on, or come on, or, I can't really just slip into it and imitate it, but I had more of a Southern Appalachian, whatever accent then. And so gradually, one example I think about, I took a class at Simmons College that was called Whiteness, Anti-Racism, and Justice. And it was an incredible course that changed the trajectory of my life in many ways, certainly in my career. And in that class, apparently I learned at the end of the class that they would, there was sort of this bet going to see how many times they could get me to say white. Because everyone else was from New England and they did not say white. And now I can hear sometimes that I say white instead of white. And so that's a word that as someone who studies whiteness, I learned that if I said whiteness, that, it mattered. It had an impact on me. There are all kinds of other little phrases. I now know that this is hyper regional, but I grew up, I think I talked about this in the essay, but I grew up calling a hat that here in Maine, they would call a knit cap. I called that a toboggan. And I think that is hyper regional. Anybody else here call it a toboggan?
We call it toboggans here.
Toboggan.
My second husband, he's from Texas. So when I first said, you need a toboggan, he's like, a what? I was like, a toboggan. He's like, that's a sled. Yeah. He's like, you mean a beanie? And I'm like, no.
To me, a beanie has a spinny thing on top. It's a different kind.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah. So I guess where I am now, I also just left my position in academia last year, and I didn't realize how much I was carrying an anxiety about making sure that these mostly prep school kids at this elite college where I was teaching, I was afraid that they were going to judge me. And so I think that's probably the time that my accent changed the most, is when I was teaching at this elite college. And now that I have left that college, I'm trying to let it relax and have a neighbor who's from Kentucky, and she's often out in her garden, and I just go and talk to her. And when I walk away, it's like I know how to say white again. But it is a loss. I think most people who have shifted away from their accent do regret that. And I certainly do. I hope that it might be something that I can tap back into and recover.
I think that's the saddest part of this. It's because your language and the words you grew up with as a child, you have to give those up and change who your culture, basically, your language to fit into the larger society. It's like losing a language.
Yeah.
I was at a conference one time, a library conference, and they were doing something on the dialect of the hills. And this was all West Virginia hills, but I'm sure, toboggan is here too. So I'm sure a lot of these phrases were more than just in West Virginia.
Yeah. And
he took the instructor, which I don't remember who the guy was now, but he was talking about, we had subtitles on these when they recorded. They put subtitles later so you would understand what they're saying. And when he played these recordings, it was like hearing my grandmother speak. I mean, I almost cried because it's like, oh, this is what I grew up with. These are the people I love.
Yep.
So it's really sad to lose that.
It is. I just have been reading the Foxfire, I can't get the title in mind. It's the Foxfire book, but it's especially focused on women. It's maybe just called Foxfire Women. And it's a collection. I don't know if you know about Foxfire.
Oh, yeah, we have the collection here.
Yeah.
Okay. But in North Georgia, and, it's a project where students went and interviewed people in their community, similar to Apple Shop, actually, and recorded their stories. And I was just reading that last night, and some of them are like in the 60s and 70s, and many of them were, close to 100 years old. And the way that their language is captured there helped me kind of tap back into what you're talking about, that they're like hearing the way that my great aunt talked, or that my granny would use phrases and her accent. I do think it can be recovered, but it has to be captured.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, I do think that dialect is so important to try to hold on to. David Joy is a novelist who lives in Western North Carolina, where I'm from. And when I read his books, the way that he captures the language, it's so nuanced and subtle, and it's just like people there speak. And I think that's such a gift that he's a fiction writer, but when people can capture that, whether it's by recording it or capturing it in fiction or, in song, whatever it is, just to hold on to it, because it's the sort of thing that you have to be really active about protecting, or it does become homogenized.
I agree.
All right, so that's basically all the prep questions we had. Did you guys have anything that you wanted to ask in the library peeps?
Oh, I did at the beginning, but now I've already forgotten it because I got too involved in the...
All of my questions were asked.
I was going to say, I put my questions on the sheet.
Yeah, I did.
Okay,
sorry.
sure
I was prepared for once.
If you think of something, hop in at some point, because we're just about done. So you guys have, both of you have written some other things, and I'm sure you do all kinds of other work. We're all busy people. Is there anything you want to talk about in particular that you've been working on recently, or that you've done, or that you think people should check out?
Well, I have not. I'm sort of a generalist cultural historian of America. And so I've expanded beyond Appalachia in some ways to think about distinctions between urban and rural, and conceptions of urban and rural, and particularly the conception of flyover country and what it means, where it emerges from, what it signifies, how it's changed and become increasingly politicized in recent years. So that's one thing I've worked on, conceptions of the Middle West a little bit as well. And then I've done work on representations of Kentucky in the 20th century. I wrote a piece on that, and I wrote a piece on Julian Goodman, who was the president of NBC in the 1960s into the 70s and was from this region. Went to Western Kentucky University for a while, and just a sort of vision that he had of television as this unifying force for good, and sort of traced his history a little bit as and how his place as a rural person, I think, helped him in both conceptualizing media as a force for unification, and also helped him in his job, because he could sort of be a everyman and not just be a New York elitist or whatever. So those are works I've been doing.
I'm realizing right now that a lot of what I'm working on really was kind of launched by the process of writing of doing Appalachian Reckoning. So that essay on and on was the first time I had written something that wasn't purely academic. And it was really powerful to have people read and respond to it, because a lot of the scholarly work that you write, very, very few people ever read it. And we just kind of know that that's the case. But it was really, it shifted something in me. And so I started writing more nonfiction essays. And so lots of those have gotten published, and that's exciting. But the other thing, and Tony, this is fun to share this with you, and I have been working on a book project. And in the opening, I talk about you, Tony, because I say I was raised with the story of a Cherokee ancestor. And I mentioned that in On and On, which I'm sort of embarrassed about now and wish I could take it back, but that's, how we evolve. And at some point you, Tony, said, well, why don't you research this? And I was like, I'm not a historian. That I don't think I could. And then I realized, and then maybe I admitted this to you at the time, but I realized that part of why I hadn't researched this myth was that I was afraid it would be a myth. And so I finally did all of this ancestry work. I spent a ton of time with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians to trace the story of that ancestor. And it's woven together with a narrative about my mom passed away about 6 years ago. And really all of these essays or these remembrances of hers, and this question of like, how do we remember anyone? How do we kind of keep their memories alive? But also a big reckoning with place and what does it mean to be from a place and not live there. So all of that's kind of braided together in a book project that's tentatively titled Bloodlines. But a lot of it started, Tony, because you said, why don't you just research it? So I did.
Well, I mean, that's fantastic. And I'm so glad that's going to be coming out because, I think, it's everyone can be a historian if they want to be. There's no secret.
It's kind of hard though.
Recipe or anything.
Yeah, we were actually talking about how people should not gatekeep academia nearly as much as it has been historically gatekept. So,
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think we just talked about that last episode, the one that should come out before this one. So, yeah, definitely true.
I'm excited
for the most part,
for that new book you were talking about.
Yeah,
I mean, because I think most people that live in this region have that myth.
Mm-hmm.
So that's exciting.
Well, there's a reason that we have a myth, and there's a reason that it's almost never true. And so that's part of what I'm looking at. But it all has to do with whiteness and maintenance of power, and it's a destructive story that gets told. So the book is out with agents, so hopefully it will be out in the world before too long.
Okay, so no release date yet, though, right?
No.
Okay, well, definitely, we'll try to keep an eye out for it. But if you do have a release date at some point, just send us an email. We'll definitely either talk about it or maybe have you on again. That'd be fun.
Sounds great.
All right, cool. Does anybody else have any other questions?
No, I think we've summed everything up.
I think it was great.
It was a great episode. Thank you guys so much for coming on. Again, this has really been a treat just to be able to discuss stuff and and know that we are validated and being frustrated and also aware that, there's a problem, but that's not the only thing.
Thank you so much for having us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming.
And great. It's great to see Meredith.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. We got to connect you guys back together a little bit.
That's right.
Our next episode, we will be discussing my deep dive pick, Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant, and I'm really excited to discuss this with everyone. It was so much fun, and I loved reading it again. We will then be having a book chat with special guest Angela Collier, and you can find her on YouTube, and she's also been reviewing books lately too. Pretty fun. Followed by that, Ariel and I will be bringing you a Curiosities on Mermaids and lore alike. So, I'm not theming it or anything. And then we'll be discussing Carla's nonfiction pick. That is all we have for today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's time for us to sign off. But before we go, only the best libraries have librarians who don't shush you. We are still shushing JD Vance though.